Let's start. Threats in this position are: pawn takes knight, bishop takes pawn, queen takes knight, queen takes rook, check. Checks in this position are: bishop to h7, check, queen takes rook, check. The best move in puzzle position is queen to d3, f5, knight to e6, bishop takes knight, pawn takes bishop. Another puzzle. Threats in puzzle position are: knight takes pawn, knight takes pawn, bishop takes knight, rook takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. Answer to this puzzle is: rook takes pawn, queen to a5, before, queen takes pawn, rook to b1, queen takes rook, knight takes queen. Another one. The threats are: queen takes knight. Checks in this position are: queen to c4, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle: rook to b3, knight to f2, check, king to g1, knight takes rook, check, rook takes queen. One more. Let us look at threats in puzzle position: queen takes pawn, queen takes pawn, queen takes pawn, check, queen takes pawn, check, knight takes pawn, check, knight takes pawn. The checks are: queen to c6, check, queen to e6, check, queen takes pawn, check, queen takes pawn, check, queen to b5, check, knight takes pawn, check. Solution to the puzzle is: queen takes pawn, rook to g1, check, king to e2, queen to g2, check, king to d3, queen takes pawn, check, knight to e3, rook takes rook, rook takes rook. Let's continue. Threats in this position are: knight takes pawn, queen takes knight, check, queen takes bishop, rook takes pawn. Let us look at checks in puzzle position: queen takes knight, check, queen to d3, check, rook to h1, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle: rook to h1, check, king to g2, rook to h2, check, king takes rook, queen takes knight, check, king to h1, queen to h4, check. Let us go to the next puzzle. Here are the threats. There are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. Answer to this puzzle is: h5, king to b5, f4, pawn takes pawn, b5. Let's continue. The threats are: there are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. Solution to the puzzle is: g6, pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, h5. Next, the threats are: knight takes pawn, pawn takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. Here is the solution to the puzzle: knight to g4, bishop takes bishop, knight takes queen, bishop takes queen, rook takes bishop. Next, here are threats in puzzle position: queen takes queen. There are no checks in this position. The best move in puzzle position is: queen takes queen, pawn takes queen, king to b2, king to g6, king to a3, f4, king to a4, king to g5, king takes pawn. Next, threats in this position are: knight takes knight, king takes bishop. There are no checks in this position. The answer is: king takes bishop, queen to g5, check, king to h1, queen to h6, f4. Let's see the next puzzle. Threats in this position are: rook takes pawn, queen takes pawn, queen takes pawn, bishop takes bishop, bishop takes pawn, pawn takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. The answer is: knight to g2, knight to c5, bishop takes knight. Next puzzle. Let us look at threats in puzzle position: queen takes pawn, check, queen takes knight, bishop takes pawn. Here are the checks: queen takes pawn, check, queen to h6, check, queen to h7, check, queen to h8, check, rook to d7, check. Answer to this puzzle is: queen takes pawn, check, king to h8, queen to h4, check, king to g8, rook to d6. Let's see the next puzzle. Threats in puzzle position are: there are no threats in this position. Checks in this position are: rook to a7, check, Rook to d2, check. The best move in puzzle position is g7. King to e8. Rook to a7. Let's continue. The threats are bishop takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. Rook takes pawn, check. Here are the checks. Queen takes pawn, check. Rook takes pawn, check. The best move in puzzle position is queen to d2. Rook takes bishop. Queen to h6. Rook to h4, check. Queen takes rook. Next, the threats are queen takes pawn. Rook takes knight. Knight takes knight. Bishop takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. The answer is knight takes knight. Rook takes knight. Rook takes rook. Queen to c3. Rook to d4. Knight takes rook. Knight to a2. Another puzzle. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. King takes rook. There are no checks in this position. Solution to the puzzle is king takes rook. King to f1. King to d4. King to e2. King to c3. King to d1. King to d3. One more. The threats are rook takes rook. Bishop takes pawn, check. Bishop takes bishop. Here are the checks. Bishop takes pawn, check. The answer is knight to e4. Rook takes rook. Bishop takes pawn, check. King takes bishop. Queen to h4, check. King to g1. Knight takes queen. Let's continue. The threats are rook takes pawn, check. Checks in this position are rook takes pawn, check. The answer is b6. Rook to g3, check. King to f5. Next puzzle. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are there are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. The puzzle is solved using e5. Pawn takes pawn. c5. b4. King to g3. b3. King to f3. h4. King takes pawn. Next, here are the threats. There are no threats in this position. Checks in puzzle position are b6, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. b6, check. King to e8. King to b4. Knight to e4. c5. Let's continue. The threats are knight takes bishop. There are no checks in this position. Solution to the puzzle is knight takes bishop. Queen to f5. Knight takes rook. Rook to a5. Queen to c2. Rook to c5. Queen takes rook. Pawn takes queen. Rook takes pawn. Next puzzle. The threats are rook takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn, check. Here are checks in puzzle position. Rook to a6, check. Pawn takes pawn, check. h5, check. The answer is rook to a6, check. King to h5. Rook to a5. Rook to c8. Rook takes pawn, check. Next, the threats are there are no threats in this position. Checks in puzzle position are bishop to g1, check. The answer is b3. Rook to e7. King to f3. h5. e2. h6. Bishop to e3. Rook takes bishop, check. King takes rook. Next puzzle. The threats are queen takes knight. Rook takes knight. There are no checks in this position. The answer is rook takes knight. Knight to h2. Rook to g7. Queen to h4. Rook takes pawn, check. Let's continue. Here are the threats. Queen takes knight. Bishop takes bishop. The checks are rook to e1, check. Knight to g3, check. Solution to the puzzle is before. Bishop takes bishop. Pawn takes knight. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.